समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
As trade talks between India and the United States resume, what explains Donald Trump's sudden change of heart? Trump dialed Modi to wish him for his birthday. Both leaders then effusively posted about each other on social media, X and Truth Social. The big questions still remain. Can India trust Trump? Will Modi invest the kind of political capital in the relationship with the Trump administration as he had done before? I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. On the program today, we'll be talking to Wall Street columnist and geopolitical analyst Sadanand Dhume in a moment from now, as we try and decode what made Donald Trump suddenly extend a hand of friendship. The thaw is now quite evident. Donald Trump dialed Prime Minister Modi. The context was Narendra Modi's 75th birthday, but the significance was not lost on anyone. The phone call came after weeks of saber rattling by the Trump administration, led by trade advisors like Peter Navarro, who have not skipped a beat before insulting India. In fact, Navarro's latest was to claim that it was Modi who had first posted on social media and Trump reciprocated. Looking at the chronology of events, that is simply not true. In both instances, it has been first Trump who has taken to social media and then the Prime Minister has reciprocated. In this context, it was Trump who dialed Prime Minister Modi and then both leaders took to social media. The big questions still remain. What happened suddenly? Why did Trump decide to make this phone call? Was there something in the back channel? Was there someone in the back channel? And going forward, can Modi trust Trump again? Can India trust the United States of America under the Trump administration again? We'll be cutting across live to Sadanand Dhume in just a moment. But for anyone following late night satire and comedy in the United States of America, the Jimmy Kimmel show has been pulled. It's been taken off air indefinitely. This is one more casualty in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Charlie Kirk was a ally of Donald Trump. He was shot at a university campus, and since then we have seen a slew of axes falling on media personalities in the United States of America. Some might say this is yet further example of the end of American exceptionalism and how America is changing under Donald Trump, or it can certainly never claim in a way to be the arbiter of democratic values across the globe. So that's another interesting development that has taken place. Let's bring in our newsmaker today, Sadanand Dhume, Wall Street Journal a columnist as well as a strategic affairs analyst, is with us. Always good to see you. Sadanand, here's the mystery that nobody has an answer to. What happened suddenly? Were these officials working in the back channels? Was it something else? Was it the images of the power huddle between Modi, Xi and Putin at the SCO summit in China? The last certainly got the Western media to finally report in a big way the story of the tariff standoff between India and the United States of America. What do you think happened?
Well, a couple of things, right? I mean, first of all, obviously there is contact behind the scenes. Obviously, you have diplomats who are in touch. Obviously, you have people basically trying to patch things up, trying to find a route out of the impasse that we seem to be in. So I think that's something that is constant. That's not new. The second thing is that if you notice, even when you had, fairly belligerent statements coming out, from Washington, from people like Peter Navarro and Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent, and from Trump himself when he was talking about the Indian economy, for example, and the Indian role in the Russia-Ukraine war, you should notice that Trump never said anything negative about Modi. He always was careful to refer to Modi as his friend and talk about how he got along well with Modi. And obviously, that's been the case from the Indian side too. So I think that if you sort of look at this carefully, you can see that at the leader level, both of these countries have made sure not to personalize the antagonism. It means there's still a route back to some kind of normalcy. That's my interpretation. Does this mean that we're going to see a trade deal? Does this mean that the very high tariff that the US has imposed on India is going to go away? Does this mean that we go back to normal? I think it's way too early to say. And I think even if you do get back to something resembling normalcy, the damage done by the last few months is going to linger for a while. But I'm not particularly surprised that there is communication between the two leaders, because I think that both sides have been careful not to burn at least that final boat.
I mean, I do agree with you that, through all of the rants, even Navarro, nobody actually targeted the prime minister personally. But surely that's not the point, because, the phrases used at one point by folks like Navarro were to call the Russia invasion of Ukraine as Modi's war. I mean, that's absolutely sort of ludicrous, right? Whatever you may think in America of India's purchase of Russian oil, Putin's war can't be called Modi's war. And, the point has been made again and again and again about China purchasing more oil from Russia than India, and Trump basically not having the guts to go for China in a way that they went for India. So structurally, something was off was there a good cop, bad cop strategy? Or do folks like Navarro, Lutnick, Scott Pissant really think like this?
Look, I think that there's a sort of, I think the question with Navarro is that, he's an advisor to the president, but it's not as though he holds some very responsible position, right? He's not the Commerce Secretary. He's not the Treasury Secretary. He has very unconventional views on trade. They happen to be views that are similar to the president's, obsessed with tariffs and trade deficits and so on. Now, it's not clear to me the degree to which he was, everything that Navarro said was meant to be communicated by the United States government. My guess is that this is, a guy who knows the president, who's known the president for a long time, who has his own strong views, who likes his own voice and sounds off. And it's not something that was necessarily sort of scripted by the president or by the administration. But at the same time, they may have found it convenient because, like, okay, this guy can in his own way apply pressure. And if you look at sort of the way Trump approaches a lot of things, it would fit with that pattern. So my guess is it's not as though that there was some sort of coordinated plan and where Navarro is, Navarro, why don't you go out and say these things? But it was more like, well, let Navarro do his thing and let that just be part of the, ambient noise out there. Maybe it sort of, pushes things closer towards a deal. Obviously, this administration doesn't care too much about causing offense, which is something I've criticized in my Wall Street Journal column. I think it's sort of silly to and counterproductive to cause offense for the sake of causing offense. But that's not how they see it. So I wouldn't overread, I wouldn't read grand strategy into Peter Navarro's comments. I think the basic point is that there are a couple of things. I mean, the first is that, there was this, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. There was the fact that President Trump genuinely seemed to want credit for the U.S. role in the ceasefire between India and Pakistan after Operation Sindoor. And that obviously, for obvious political reasons, was not something that Prime Minister Modi was in a position to offer. And that, I think, really did, at some point, rub the president the wrong way. There was the famous June 17th phone conversation and so on. And then more substantively, I think what happened on the trade deal is that there was a great deal of optimism. It looked like the two sides were very close to getting to a deal. And at some point, it looked like the U.S. was going to sign off. But then, they looked at what other countries were doing. And even though India had made an offer which historically by Indian standards was extraordinarily forward-looking and generous, I think the US administration found that many other countries were making offers that, at least on paper, were even more generous. And so then the Indian offer didn't look as good as it had before. So I think there's sort of, there's a substantive issue that is stalled. And then there's the kind of the atmospherics that were caused from the fallout of Operation Sindoor and President Trump wanting publicly to be acknowledged as some kind of peacemaker.
A number of analysts based out of the United States of America kept making the point in these few weeks that India's message was not getting through to Donald Trump himself, that this was a top-down administration, that there was something inadequate about our messaging. And there was even debate about how maybe India's diplomacy was not wired for the age of Trump, where everything about Trump plays out publicly in the public domain. My question to you, with the benefit of some hindsight, is this. India didn't actually blink. We don't know what the back channel talks are, but in the public domain, in the gaze of their own people, India did not blink. India took a position. India kept to that position. The only comment that the Prime Minister made was to say that he was ready to pay a personal price, but the areas that had always been protected from tariffs would remain protected. I mean, he didn't use the word tariffs. I'm sort of paraphrasing here, right? My question to you is, do you agree, A, that India did not blink, and therefore actually Trump has had to backpedal some of his crazy rhetoric? And if so, what do you think swung that?
So I think it's absolutely clear that India has not blinked. I don't think either side has blinked, really. I do think that the government of India does deserve credit for playing its hand rather calmly, right? I mean, one can, you and I, Barkha, can imagine a circumstance where, India would have decided that this is going to play really well with the domestic base. Let's lash out at the US. Let's lash out at the US president. And I think that it's required a certain degree of maturity and restraint that reflects very well on India, that they've sort of been like, we're going to play the long game. We're going to be firm. We're not going to take the bait. And we're going to see how this plays out. And so I think that the way the government of India has dealt with this has been mature, has been calm. I think with with President Trump, I think what we have to sort of look at is, where does this land in the end? And there are all these, the different parts. There's the Russia-Ukraine part where, somehow, India has now become part of that issue because of its oil purchases, despite the fact that, as you say correctly, China buys more oil and the Europeans obviously buy more gas and so on. But, there's the fate of the Russia-Ukraine war, to which now India is linked. And then there's the fate of the trade negotiation itself. And then there's sort of the public aspect. And what makes this tricky is that typically American presidents have tried very hard to nurture the US-India relationship, particularly over the last 25 years, and they have not particularly been in the business of getting public credit. And I think for the first time, India is dealing with not for the first time, they dealt with him in the first term also, but this is a president who is, he is different. So for example, when they come to a deal, if they come to a deal, they'll have to find a way that gives President Trump face and makes him look like a winner in front of his people and in front of his base, but at the same time makes Modi look like a winner in front of his people and in front of his base, because neither of these two leaders are in a position where they can be seen as bending the knee to the other. And I think this is a sort of, it's a tricky dance. I do think that there's enough diplomatic skill in both capitals to pull it off, but it is a tricky dance, no doubt.
But for speaking from an Indian perspective, for India to not look like, it has surrendered before America's bullying, the so-called penalty, the extra 25% that's been slapped as we're wrapping you on the knuckles, you've bought oil from Russia, that's the part that Trump has to walk back. And at one point, it looked like that would get taken care of if Trump could bring home actually a deal on Russia-Ukraine. Given that that hasn't happened, what is the possible face saver that this part of the tariff, even if, let's say, they reach an agreement on the first 25%, the so-called penalty, I mean, how does Trump explain that? How does India explain that if it continues to be in place and India continues to act all pally-wally with Trump?
So I think you can come to a face saver for both people. And I kind of outlined the sort of the bare bones of this in one of my columns in the Wall Street Journal. I think Trump can be given a face saver if, first of all, you come to a deal, India does allow some amount of agricultural imports from the US. It, cuts some of its, completely ridiculous duties on some things. maybe there's sort of, there is just some more room where Trump can say that, well, look, India has done this, which he hadn't done before. And already a lot of that is already on the table, right, where India has offered zero tariffs on many US goods and so on. So I think India could do that. It could also combine it in some way, maybe not officially, maybe unofficially. They could combine it with, in a way, with, by taking a leaf out of the book of the Japanese and the South Koreans who have, promised investment pledges. So I don't think there's anything stopping, say, CII or FICCI from, bringing together 10 or 15 of the top Indian businessmen and them saying that they are going to invest in the United States and so on. Give something that makes Trump, look like a winner and feel like a winner. I think what Trump can do for India, so that this looks like a win-win on the Indian side also, is very simple. The first, as you correctly mentioned, you have to get rid of that 25%. The 25%, what they would refer to even as a sanction, it makes no sense. It's not logical. It's not a reasonable position by any standard. But I think you'd have to go beyond that at this point. And I think going beyond that would mean if India ends up with a final tariff, this is what I would recommend, as lower than the tariffs of its competitors. So India shouldn't just be about getting rid of the 25, but let's just say India lands at 15, which is, a better tariff rate than Pakistan, better tariff rate than Vietnam, and so on. Recognizes, India as a larger market and as a natural partner of the United States. And then I really do think that Modi can go to the people of India and say that, look, I stood firm, I didn't bend, I made a mutually beneficial deal, and I have ended up with something that is, on the face of it, superior to what many other competitor nations have ended up with. I think that would be a win-win. I do think something like that is possible.
Here's also a point of concern from the Indian perspective. I don't see diplomats really fussed about this, but I know that it'll play out in a major way in media and in public sentiment. And that is Trump's sort of recent love fest with Asim Munir. In fact, that infamous 17th June phone call, it happens in a context. Trump wants the prime minister to leave Canada, come for lunch to Washington at a time when he's also entertaining Pakistan's army chief and field marshal Asim Munir. No Indian prime minister, it doesn't matter. Nobody is going to say yes to such a proposal. Now you have all of this reporting about the links between Trump's family and Pakistan's crypto council, by way of one explanation for this new cozying up. The other explanation is Pakistan actually said that Trump played this role in Operation Sindoor and Trump should get a Nobel. Pure flattery. What do you think is going on here? Because there are now reports that there will be another meeting between Munir and Trump, point one. Point two, Trump's new envoy for India, Sergio Gore, is also going to be the envoy for South and Central Asia, leading to some, I think, legitimate concerns in India about what's at play here.
So let me do the second part first, right? I think the appointment of Sergio Gore is a challenge because of this, special representative role, but is also a real opportunity. Because if you look at it, if you look at it from a domestic U.S. political prism, Sergio Gore is a real insider. He's someone who has the president's ear. He has the president's trust. This is someone who's had a key role in staffing the administration. And it's hard for me. I was trying to think back to other U.S. ambassadors, and the last one I could think of who really had as close a relationship with the president may have been Galbraith, who was the ambassador in Nehru's time. So I think in that sense, this could be an opportunity, depending on how India plays its cards, to have somebody who has the president's ear and has the president's trust to kind of understand and to be entrusted with this job, which is obviously in a way signifies the importance of India for the U.S. administration. So I think that's broadly a positive. And on Pakistan, I think what India will have to kind of come to terms with is that it will have to learn to live with some of the optics, right? And I agree that the optics are problematic in terms of domestic opinion, but India's red lines on Pakistan, as far as the U.S. is concerned, should be realistic. And I think the red line that ought to be drawn is a resumption of arms sales, because that really directly affects India's interests. It directly affects India's security. Is it ideal that President Trump seems to, be meeting with Asim Munir regularly. He invited him to the White House and so on. Obviously, it isn't from an Indian that isn't true from an Indian perspective, but it's also true that India routinely meets with the Indian Prime Minister routinely meets with all kinds of leaders, including most recently Putin and Xi Jinping in Tianjin, and that's just what leaders of big countries do. So I don't think that in itself is an issue. Question is that has U.S. policy fundamentally shifted in South Asia? I think there's cause for concern, but right now at this point, I don't see any evidence of particularly deep U.S.-Pakistan cooperation. Is Pakistan out of the doghouse? Absolutely, it is out of the doghouse. But does that mean that we're kind of like going back to something that is, something like the 1970s or 1980s, or even the early 2000s, Barkha? Remember the sort of Musharraf era where Pakistan was so important in the world? I don't see that happening, and at least for now, that's certainly not my assessment.
But on the Sergio Gore point, yes, he's an insider, but the fact that as envoy for all of South Asia, he will be based in Delhi, recognizes Delhi to be the pivot or the seat of power or, maximum relevance. But there is that concern of, that famous word hyphenation.
Yeah, and I think that if we're sort of totally honest, there's an element of that seems to have, crept back in. I think this has less to do with Pakistan's efforts, so that does have something to do, and perhaps it has something to do with some of the, the things you mentioned, both the cryptocurrency investments, and then also the Pakistani willingness to nominate Donald Trump to the Nobel Peace Prize and really, play to what he wants. That is certainly part of it, but I think the bigger concern, and what ought to be the biggest concern if you're sitting in New Delhi right now in South Block, is really America's assessment of China. Now, we all had an assumption that this administration, like previous administrations, is going to place China at the heart of its foreign policy, and that automatically, raises India's profile. If the Trump administration decides that it is not in the business of great power competition, then I think a lot of these things that we're talking about begin to look much more problematic for India, because then the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, it takes on a different color. But as long as China, and we'll have a sense of this, within a few months, as long as China remains sort of pivotal to American foreign policy and American military policy, I think that there'll be very, very strong pressures internally to come to some kind of arrangement with India.
So this was, you sort of took away my next question on Trump is scheduled to speak with Xi Jinping. There's some sort of TikTok deal in the works. But from an Indian perspective, what matters is what's the future of the Quad? Is India still seen to be a countervailing force to the rise of China? There's enough reporting to suggest that if Trump he would cut a deal or would want to cut a deal with the Chinese, which is going to be much tougher given the kind of choke points that China has in terms of leverage. Do you believe that there is a kind of, there's all this talk of a new security doctrine or a new strategic doctrine that's going to come from the Pentagon, that even words or language like Indo-Pacific could be changed, that the focus is now going to be much more on Trump's, immediate backyard, that this whole idea of Asia and using India as a sort of checkmating force against China, all that is a thing of the past under this administration. Do you think it's moving in that direction? You think it's too early to say that?
So there are two parts to that, right? One is the US still interested in competing with China in Asia, or is the US moving toward towards more of a sphere of influence kind of view of the world, where the US will say that, the Western Hemisphere is ours, you keep out of Venezuela, and we'll come to some kind of trade agreement with China, trade and technology agreement, and then we don't particularly care about what the Chinese do in Asia, right? That's one half of it. The second half of it is that let's just say that the US continues to see China as its major geopolitical competitor, and it continues to be the sort of central organizing principle for US foreign and defense policy. Then the question is, how important is India in that, right? So it's possible that the US continues to see China as a major force, but then sort of feels that India hasn't done enough, for example, to modernize its military, hasn't done enough to reform its economy, has fallen behind so dramatically that maybe it's not as big a deal in terms of, in its importance. Maybe the Quad doesn't really count for that much. So those are the two, those are the two elements that I think people should be looking out for. There's certainly reporting out there. You and I we read the same pieces. There's reporting out there that suggests a new U.S. national security strategy may actually be moving away from a China-centric vision. We'll just have to see. Look, all I can say is that it would be very unusual for the world's leading power, right? I mean, this goes against a lot of sort of what academic theory, which is that normally when you have a world's dominant power and then you have a rising power, in this case China, it is natural for the dominant power to seek to maintain its perch at the top. So so anything is possible. We live in very interesting and very fluid times, but I would not jump to the conclusion just yet that the US is abandoning what has been a long-held position on China.
So I want to end with a lot of commentary that looks at the United States as a kind of declining hegemon, right? There is one school of thought that believes that the place that America occupied in global power, global imagination, it's still a supremely powerful country, but it's a country that, because of its own churn, there is something shifting. And here I want to come to, I like poking the bear on this because I've been so bored with grandstanding American editorials on democracy around the world, including in India. But when we see,
especially from your former newspaper,
Washington Post, which is going through its own crazy churn. But let's talk for a moment about what's happening in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, right? And I'm trying to link it to this broader conversation about America being sort of the leading light in terms of democratic values of the world. So we just saw the Jimmy Kimmel show being pulled, taken off air indefinitely. We've seen previously other people in the media, including in MSNBC, for example, lose their job. It's a kind of competitive cancel culture here right now. It's clearly the conservatives who are leading this cancel culture. And many of us looking at this would say, oh my God, if this were to have happened in India. I mean, can you imagine 4 anchors losing their shows, 4 columnists losing their column? How many miles of sort of op-ed space would have been devoted to, declining democracy in India? So I think the question must be reversed. Is democracy declining in America?
Yeah, so, I don't see this as, I think a lot of people in India view this in sort of competitive terms, right? I don't think this is a competition. Like, it's completely possible to say that, 4 anchors losing their show in India is a sign of democratic backsliding or a shrinking of media freedom. And so is Jimmy Kimmel getting his show canceled. Both things can be true.
Of course. It's just that they're not seen often in the same way. Like, you won't have Indian editorials on America's declining democracy.
But you should, right? I mean, you should write a column in the Hindustan Times that points this out and just say that, well, look, you've got this guy, he's lost his position. You've got the president himself who's crowing about it. You have the FCC commissioner talking about it. And this is really not, what one expects from the land of the First Amendment. And this is certainly, it's perfectly legitimate to then point out that, well, then, please stop lecturing us because, look, put your own house in order. But if you sort of, step out of it and look at it, I mean, to me, it's a tragedy either way, because I do believe in free speech. I do think the First Amendment is a wonderful thing. I hope that this sort of ship is righted. And I also care about freedom of expression in India. So I think it's not a question of, well, okay, well, I can understand the sort of Schadenfreude, right? Which is that if you're always getting lectures from one country, you're just sort of like, well, okay, well, look. But beyond that, I think we really should be concerned, right? Those of us who are, in the media, those of us who think and speak and write for a living, we should be concerned, because if the US, goes down this path, obviously it'll be very bad news for the US, but it'll be bad news for the whole world.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it exposes other crises in media the world over, from Delhi to New York, about broken revenue models. How dependent so many people in the media are for big companies and corporations to actually prop them up, and you know, that's another debate for another time. But I just want to end with asking you: do you see the US as a declining hegemon?
No, I think if you look at it in terms of GDP and if you look at it in terms of military power, the US has remained remarkably stable. The changes that we've seen over the last 25 years have really been the Europeans losing what was their larger role in the world. I think the US in some ways is, facing, I think it's legitimate to say that there's sort of the amount of political flux we're seeing here domestically is tarnishing the image of American exceptionalism, which really is a real thing. And particularly, those of us who sort of, came of age in the post-Cold War era when the US was a hyperpower, there was no other game in town. Obviously, that has changed. Obviously, the Chinese they've caught up in some domains, right? You no longer, and so I think that's true. But I would just caution people who talk, about U.S. decline as, the U.S. has been seen as declining many times in the last 50 years. It was seen as in decline after Vietnam. And then 15 years later, it had bounced back. It had won the Gulf War. The Soviet Union had collapsed. So right now, it looks like, there are other systems that seem to be challenging the U.S. But if you take the larger sweep of history, right, this is a country that has been dominant for a long, long time. And if one is hopeful about the U.S., one is hopeful that it has the domestic capacity to regenerate itself, to bounce back from these problems, and to come, and to retain its place of preeminence. So whether this is something long term or whether this is just a temporary setback is up for debate. But I do think it's perfectly fair for people to point out that there are certain domestic developments and also the rise of competitor nations do make the U.S. look less strong than it was, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, for sure.
Yeah, and absolutely. And domestic politics in the US is going to have its own impact on geopolitics. How Trump does in the midterms is also going to define a lot of what he can and can't do, or where his focus will be, at least. I would say that. But we leave it there. Sadanand Dhume, Wall Street Journal columnist, strategic affairs analyst. Thank you so much. And we look forward to connecting with you again, because as the Chinese would say, we certainly live in interesting times, and even that would be an understatement. Thank you so much.
Too interesting.
Too interesting.
Okay, bye.
Good for journalism. Take care and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.